Hi, this is Evan Risk, and this is my project on media literacy and high school ELL students. So first we're going to start with the problem, okay? The problem is that people can access a massive amount of information very quickly, okay? So as we know, not all information is good, nor is all that information accurate, okay? So spotting misinformation is even more important on years like this, right? In 2020, an election year, and right in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, so students now, as we know, are able to access a lot of information extremely quickly. So we need to be able to teach students to decide whether the information is accurate or not. Okay? The World Health Organization even went as far to call our current situation an infodemic. So the problem, separating real news from fake news. Okay? So students need to think about the source. This is a good way for students to find out whether or not a source is valid and whether or not the information they're hearing is valid. Okay? So one thing that we found is that people tend to believe family or friends and think of them as the source. Okay? So for example, if I hear something about coronavirus from my mom or my cousin, I'm going to think, if I'm like most people, that okay, I trust that person, I know that person, that's probably accurate information. As opposed to if we hear it from a source, like a news source, ABC News, NBC, something like that, we think of that source as the information. But if, for example, my mom hears something on ABC News and tells me about it, people tend to think of that last person as the source of information. And this is a really big way that information spreads. That misinformation spreads. So in a study done by the American Journal of Folklore, over half of high school students were not able to tell whether a source was reliable or whether a source was fake. Okay, whether a news story was accurate or whether it was made up. And most students spend an average of 12 hours a day consuming media. Okay, so we know that students are consuming media constantly. That doesn't necessarily mean like news media, but just in general media like Snapchat, Facebook, all types of social media. Students are on average spending 12 hours a day consuming media. So how do we solve this problem? How do we teach students media literacy? One way to teach students media literacy is through social studies teaching and source analysis. Okay, so for example, let's say we are talking about World War I, right? One way to help students understand the different points of view and to understand which sources are valid is to read a variety of sources, talk about different things from each point of view, and then decide for themselves which source is valid or is it a combination, and then that way go ahead and understand that history, okay, by understanding the different points of view. So I put together 3 plans to help teach students media literacy. So plan number 1 was for students to try and understand and answer this question: what was life like for immigrants approximately 100 to 150 years ago? So to do this, I had students analyze multiple sources using the CARS method. And CARS stands for credibility, accuracy, reasonableness, and support. Okay? And then my idea was to have students work in pairs and analyze these sources using that CARS method. Okay? When they analyze these sources, my idea was to have them put it in a Prezi, okay, a presentation, and then have them present it in front of the class. So plan 2 was weekly current event analysis. So for this, students would pick a topic such as natural disasters, coronavirus, climate change, something like that. Research that one topic from a variety of sources. My idea was to have students first research the topic, for example, climate change, by looking at social media. If they were subscribers to any social media, first look at what it says there, then look at a couple different sources and see if that is accurate. See if that lines up. If what their friends are saying about climate change is the same thing that other news sources are saying about climate change. And then analyze the differences for that same topic. What was the same? What was different? Okay. And then the third plan, this was for intermediate or advanced level ELL students. The idea was to put them in groups of 3 or 4, have them give them cards with descriptions of a media source. Okay, so give them cards that have different sources, whether that be like a mainstream source, like ABC, NBC, New York Times, Fox News, MSNBC. Cards with descriptions of different media sources in those groups of 3 or 4. And then they can debate which sources are the most reputable and most valid. And then after that, have students read those 3 or 4 reliable sources and then discuss current events. So the goal of that was to teach students how to find a reliable source and then use that to get information. So I went ahead and decided to implement plan number 1. And this plan was for English language learners in a U.S. history course. So many of these students in this class scored a 1 or 2 in most domains the previous year on the English language proficiency assessment, or also known as the ELPA 21. So the ELPA 21, that's something that we use in Iowa to decide a student's level of English proficiency. And having a lot of scores of 1 or 2 means that they are beginning or emerging proficiency, meaning they don't know very much English yet. They've probably only been in the country a couple of years. So students took this assessment in February 2020 and then missed school from the middle of March until September. Okay, so going into this class, students had been missing a lot of school because of the coronavirus pandemic, and there was less classroom time to start the school year. We started out the school year totally online and then went into a hybrid mode where we were half in class, half online. So students were still not getting as much face-to-face classroom time as they had previous years. So again, I decided to implement Plan 1. And the other thing that I had to change was no partner work because of COVID. We aren't allowed to have students work right next to one another. Okay, so I had to change that with the plan as well. So again, from Plan 1 was to answer the question, what was life like for immigrants? So I decided to start by doing a virtual tour of Ellis Island. It turned out for these students, the CARS test was far too difficult. It took a long time just explaining the vocabulary, and they weren't really able to apply it. They also had difficulty putting their ideas into bullet points, wanted to copy and paste or use long sentences. They really had a hard time narrowing down and summarizing ideas. And many students were SLIFE students. Okay, so SLIFE stands for Students with Limited or Interrupted Formal Education, meaning they come to school, they come to the US with not very much background. And because of this makes higher order thinking much more difficult. So the second week, I decided to change to having students create a Google slideshow instead of a Prezi. And we read different sources. This was on the American letters. So the American letters, these are letters written from people who immigrated to the US back to their home country, telling people what life was like in America. So that was our source that we read that week. So instead of doing the CARS test, I just had students answer, who wrote the document, who read the document, when was it written, and what was the main idea. And again, why did the author write the document? Okay, so who wrote it, who read or received it, the intended audience, when was it written, what was the main idea, and then finally, why did the author write it? What was his or her motivation? And this went much, much better. Okay, simplifying it, getting rid of the CARS test made it much, much simpler. So the third week, I had students read a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act and a text called The Life of Ordinary Americans. Then, so we did this together, read about the Chinese Exclusion Act and about the life of ordinary Americans. All right, so the piece that I had them read from this text was about a Chinese American and his experience coming to the US. Then I had students analyze political cartoons showing nativism, okay? And so this added to the analysis of the presentation, what was life like for immigrants? So when students did this, they still answered the same questions. Okay? Who wrote it? Who read or received it? What date? What was the main idea? And why did they write it? Now, when they did these analysis on nativism, a lot of the importance was why did the author write it? What was his or her intent? So the last week, we did whole class student presentations. Okay? I had students have one picture per slide on their Google slideshow. Presentations were mixed. Some presentations went very well. Others did not go as well. This was more difficult because of the hybrid schedule. There was less time to practice. And I had some students who struggled with analysis do simpler prompts that were more summarizing and less analysis. So project findings, again, this is something that I think is really important, to be able to teach students to analyze media or know that they're in front of media about 12 hours a day. They need to be able to analyze those different sources. And again, the World Health Organization went as far to call this an infodemic. Many students are probably able to do the CARS test. Many high school students are, but my ELL students were not able to. Okay? So instead of analyzing for the validity of source, we were able to analyze successfully for the point of view. So I was not successful in having students understand, is this source valid? But they were able to understand and express the point of view of the source. Okay. Many students had difficulty condensing ideas down to just one bullet point and 2 or 3 bullet points a slide. Okay. One thing that we talked about is students were able to understand the idea of persecution, that term, what it means, and how it applied to immigrants. Okay, so that's my presentation. Again, this project was, I would say, pretty successful. Students were able to understand different points of view, and it's something that I hope to do again next year. Thank you.